Are you like me and tired of seeing 3D models all the time? Well, today we're going to make them go away. This beginner-friendly tutorial takes you step by step through building a dissolve shader in Godot 4, and at the end of the video we will also set up a script so you can use your new effect in your game. So let's get started. So here we are in Godot. We just have this scene and we need to add a mesh so we have something to work with. I'm going to press Ctrl A, and here I will search for mesh instance 3D, and I will press create. Now let's give it a new mesh. So under mesh I will create a new sphere mesh. Now we can go into geometry, and let's under material override, let's click on that and do new shader material, and then click on that again. And in this shader, we're gonna do new shader. And that brings up this create shader window. And let's give it the name dissolve. And the type is going to be a shader, and the mode is spatial, since it's a 3D mesh. Let's click create. And let's open up our shader code by clicking on the dissolve. So we can start by removing this void light, and we can remove the vertex shader. We will only be working in the fragment, this one. So let's start by creating some uniforms. I want the first uniform to set our base color for the object. So I'm going to do uniform, and it's going to be a vector 3. So vec3, let's call this one base color. So now if we go into shader parameters, you can see we have this vector 3 with x, y, and z. But we want to use it as a color. So we need to do :source color. And now we will have our color picker here. So we can set the color of our object. And I prefer to work with the HSV, the hue, saturation, and value sliders. And I also want to set a color for the inside of the object. So when we are dissolving the object, I want to see the inside as well. So let's do uniform, also vector 3. Let's call this inside color. Also going to be a source color. Then we can leave it at black for now. Now we need a uniform to control the dissolve effect. So I'm going to do uniform float, and this one we can call dissolve amount. And let's set it to 0. So now we have this dissolve amount in the shader parameter. But I want it to only go from 0 to 1. And to fix that, we can, right after dissolve amount, let's do :, and here we can type hint range. So I want it to go from 0 to 1, and now we have a slider that goes from 0 to 1. Now we also need a texture to control our dissolve effect. So let's do a uniform sampler 2D. Let's call this one noise texture. And we can also set this one up here. So if we click on the noise texture and do a new noise texture 2D, and we click on that. I want this one to be seamless, so we can click on that one, and then in noise, we can do new fast noise. And we can just leave this one here for now. So let's start working in the fragment shader. I'm going to remove this comment. And let's first get the values from our noise texture. I'm going to create a float. I'm going to call this dissolve noise, and it's going to be equal to texture, and then we're going to give it our noise texture, and then we're going to use the UVs, so UV, and it's a float, so .r. So now let's give our object some color. So I'm going to do a vector 3. I'm going to call this surface color, and for now I'm just going to set that equal to base color. So let's assign the albedo. So I'm going to type albedo equals surface color. Now we can see we're having this blue color here. Also, if we see the object here, we change it. So let's expand that again. Now let's create this dissolve effect by using the alpha. So what we're going to do is we're going in the alpha. I'm going to type alpha, and it's going to be equal to this dissolve noise. Now if we go back we have this kind of effect, and this is not what we want. We want a harsh transition. So what we're going to use is we're going to use something called alpha scissor threshold. This will act like a cutoff point for our visibility. So this will just create this sharp transition from visible to completely dissolve. So if we do that equals to our, it's going to be equals to our dissolve amount. So now as we increase this dissolve amount, we will see that it's disappearing. And this alpha scissor threshold, it's actually discarding all transparent pixels in the rendering process. So it can be a bit better for performance than only by using the alpha, the normal alpha. Now, we're currently not seeing the inside of our object. And to fix that, we can just go at the top of code, right below shader type, we can do render mode, and we want to do call disabled. And this call disabled just means that we will be rendering both sides of the object. So now, if we go back, now we're seeing, let's remove the grid, origin. So now we're seeing the inside as well, but we're not having this inside color. It's still the blue one. So let's do if, and I want to do, let's do front facing, but I want it to be not front facing. So if we do an exclamation point right before front facing, it means if not front facing. So if it's the back faces, then I want to set the surface color going to be equal to this inside color. Now we can change the inside of the object. Let's also add some roughness to our object, so 0.5. And we're using our noise texture here to drive the dissolve. So you can change this in your noise texture. You can change the noise type, and you can play around with different values here. And you have a lot of different settings you can change and see what works for you. I'm just going to leave it at the default for now. Now, I also want to add this glowy border to our dissolve effect. So let's go back into the code. We're going to set up some more uniforms here. I want 3 uniforms, one for the glow color, the glow intensity, and the width of the border. So let's do a uniform, vector 3. We can call this glow color. And we can do this as a source, and it also needs to be a source color. And we could just give it a default value here as well. So let's give it a red as a default value. So red 1 in the red channel. So now we have this glow color here. Now let's also create a uniform. It's going to be a float. Let's call this glow intensity. We can give it a default value of 5. And then a uniform float glow border width. We can do a hint range on this one. And we want it to go from 0 to, let's say, 0.25 and a default value of 0.05. So now we have our glow uniforms set up. So now we're going to create our border mask. So in our fragment here, I'm going to create a float. And this one will be called border mask. And we're going to set it to 0. And then I only want to add to this border mask when we're using this dissolve amount. So I'm going to do an if statement here. So if our dissolve amount is greater than 0, then we will change our border mask. So let's start by creating a float here. So float, and let's call this one border size. And we want to take our dissolve amount, and we're going to add our glow border width. So this will be our full border width or border size. So now we're going to go border mask. So I'm going to use the smooth step. So I'm going to do smooth step. Now you can see that The smooth step function takes 3 arguments. The first argument is going to be where we want our transition to start, and the second argument is going to be where we want our transition to end, and the third one is what we want to apply the transition to. So I'm going to create multiple lines here. The first value here is I want the border size, and I want to subtract a value here, let's say 0.04, and in the second value I also want to do the border size, but I want to add another value. So I'm going to add 0.04. And in the third argument, I will put this dissolve noise. So what we're doing here is if our dissolve noise value is less than this first argument, then the function returns 0. And then if the dissolve noise is greater than this second argument, then it's going to return 1, but then it's going to interpolate between these 0 and 1 values, and that will create a smooth mask for us. Let's take a look at the border mask. So in our albedo here, I'm going to do albedo equals vector 3 border mask. So now we can see we're having this border mask here. This black and white, and you can see it has this smooth effect, and that is this value here. So we could actually make it a uniform here. So if you do an uniform float, let's call this one glow border smoothness, and let's give it a hint range, and let's go from 0 to maybe 0.1, and let's give it a default value of 0.04. Now we can take our glow border smoothness and we can replace this 0 and this magic number. So I just select the first one, and then I press Ctrl D, and then I paste. So now we changed those two values at the same time. So now we have this uniform that controls the smoothness of our mask, and we can control the width and smoothness. Now you can see that our mask is actually, we want it to be the other way around. I want the border to be the white part, but that's an easy fix. So right before smooth step, we're gonna take 1, minus, and subtract that with smooth step. So now we're having this border mask here. So let's go back into the code. We can comment out this albedo equals border mask by pressing Ctrl and K, which is a shortcut. Now we want to use this border mask to set some colors and emission values. So I'm going to create a new vector 3, and this one I'm going to call surface emission. And this is for our glowy parts of our shader, the emission. So I'm going to use a mix function. I only want the emission at the border mask. So I'm going to do vector 3 and set it 0, so just full black. And then we're going to have our glow color, and we're going to use our border mask. So now we can go here and do emission equals to surface emission, and let's multiply it by our glow intensity. So glow intensity. So now we're having this border mask with some emission to it. We can change the intensity, lower it. But I also want that in the surface color, we're gonna do the same mix here. Where we have our glowy parts, I want it to be black. I'm gonna do mix, base color, and the surface color of the border will be black, so vec 3, 0. And we're gonna do the border mask. So now if we set the glow intensity to 0, it's just black. And as we increase it, now we have our dissolve effect here. And then you can just play around with the noise and the values. So now we have our shader part done. Now let's also create a script so we can use this one in the game. So in our mesh instance here, I'm going to create a new script. I will just call this mesh dissolve. And in our script here, we want to set some variables. So I'm going to do var dissolve amount. Let's set this one to 0. And then we want a dissolve speed. So var dissolve speed. And let's set it to 1. And we also need the material. I'm going to var dissolve material. And it's going to be a shader material. So shader material. And to create our animation here, I will be using a tween. So let's do var tween, and it's going to be a tween. Now in our ready function, let's first get our material. So the dissolve material is going to be equal to material override. So the first thing I want to do is I want to set the dissolve to 0 just in the ready function. So I'm going to do dissolve material dot, and I want to do set shader parameter, but we're not getting autocomplete here. So what we can do is we can cast this. So right off the material override, we can just do as shader material. So now we will be getting our autocomplete here. So now set shader parameter. And the first parameter will be the name of the parameter in the shader. So that will be this dissolve amount. So in here, I will type dissolve amount. And we're going to set it to 0. So just at the beginning, it will make sure that our dissolve amount is 0. Let's create our dissolve function, which we'll be using a tween. So let's do func. Let's call this one trigger dissolve. And it's not going to return anything, so I'm gonna do void. So in here, what we need to do, we're going to do tween equals create tween. This will create our tween animation. And if you haven't used tween already, tween is a very convenient way to create some animations using code. So you need to do first create the tween, and then we're going to do tween.tween property. So what we want to change is we want to take our dissolve material that we have, and the property we want to change is in the shader parameter. It's this dissolve amount. So we need to write shader parameter and then dissolve amount. And we want it to take our dissolve amount and set it to 1. So our final value here is going to be 1. For our duration is our dissolve speed. I'm gonna do dissolve speed here. So what we're doing here is when we're triggering our dissolve, it will create a new tween, and it will tween the property on the dissolve material, the shader parameter dissolve amount, and it will set that value to 1 during this dissolve speed. Let's set up a scene here. I'm gonna do camera 3D. So we see it. Let's also add sun to scene and add environment to scene. And in our code here, we also need to trigger our dissolve. So in our process, I will do an if input is action just pressed. And we're going to use UE down, and then we will do our trigger dissolve. So when I'm pressing down on the keyboard, it will trigger dissolve. And this is just for my testing purposes. You would probably do this differently, like when the enemy dies or something, then you will trigger your own dissolve. So let's try this out. Let's run our scene. Here we have our object. I press down on the keyboard and then the dissolve effect is running. So that's good. Now we're only changing the dissolve in the shader. We're still having the object in our scene. So what we also can do is, once our tween animation is done running, has completed, we can run another function. So we can do tween dot, and this one is called tween callback. So once the tween is done, it will run this one. So I'm gonna create a new function. Let's call this one on dissolve complete. And we need to create this function. So let's do func on dissolve complete, and it will not return anything. And here I'm just going to do Q3. So this means once the dissolve amount is 1, it will just Q3 the object, remove it from the scene tree. Also, in our trigger dissolve, I want to check if we're already running a tween animation. So what we can do is if tween, if we're running a tween animation, let's just do return. So that way, if I would be pressing this down arrow multiple times, it will only create once and then it will return. Otherwise, we could get some weird issues. So let's test this out again. And everything works. And then you can just play around with this dissolve speed, for instance. Maybe you want it to dissolve more slowly. Or if you want it to be very fast. And that's how you create a basic dissolve shader in Godot. And don't forget to experiment with the properties so you can get your own look. And if you have any questions about this shader or suggestions or future tutorials, leave a comment below and let me know. Thank you for watching.